Yeah, I'm online. You guys.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our book launch of Sebastian Strangio's new book, In the Dragon's Shadow. As our audience begins to fill the Zoom webinar room, we're going to provide some time for that to happen and get started in a few minutes. My name is Brian Eyler. I'm the director of the Stimson Center Southeast Asia program, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you all here to this book launch. All right, so let's get started. Again, welcome everybody to this book launch for Sebastian Strangio's new book, In the Dragon's Shadow, Southeast Asia in the Chinese Century. We've got over 100 people on the line already. I think more will be populating the Zoom webinar room very soon. Sebastian Strangio, the author of this great new book, is joining us from Australia. We have also panelists joining us. My colleague Yun Sun, who is the director of Stimson's China program and the co-director of our East Asia program with deep expertise in China in Southeast Asia, as well as Jane Perlez joining us, the ex-bureau chief of the New York Times Bureau in Beijing, who's now based in New York. And she's preparing a multi-episode podcast on Nixon's historic visit to China. We all wait with anticipation to hear that when it's published. I found this book kind of one that I couldn't put down. Sebastian sent me a copy of In the Dragon's Shadow back in April, I believe, and I just read through it in 2 or 3 days. He takes a journey through the region, through 9 countries, which is no daunting task. My team covers Southeast Asia, and really all we can do is cover mainland Southeast Asia. 5 countries is plenty for coverage. Somehow Sebastian can do it in one book and capture China's experience in 9 countries in Southeast Asia in just this volume. And again, it's a very impressive read. We're going to dive deep into this book over the next hour. We're going to run it like this. I'm going to interview Sebastian for about 20 minutes. And then our panelists are going to provide some discussion points and reflections on their reading of the book. And then we'll have a chance for you all to interact with Sebastian in a Q&A session. And how that will work is, actually, you can start doing that now. Feel free to type questions into our Q&A box. And that will feed to my colleague, Courtney Weatherby, who will read your questions and then ask them later to Sebastian during our discussion portion. So let's get this kicked off. Again, Sebastian, welcome. It's a late night there in Australia. Hopefully we can keep you energized as we get through this, but welcome to the Stimson Center.
Thanks a lot, Brian. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, you've written so much about Southeast Asia over the last decade. In fact, it was your writing, the book Hun Sen's Cambodia, that hit my desk when I was living in China in Kunming about 6 or 7 years ago that partially inspired me to write my Mekong book, Last Days of the Mighty Mekong. But writing about China's footprint in Southeast Asia is a really complex topic. I'm curious as to what got you interested in this topic.
Well, I first came in contact with this topic during the time that I lived and worked as a journalist in Cambodia. I was there from 2008 to 2016. And those 8 years witnessed a remarkable transformation and expansion of China's visible presence in the country. During that period, China became Cambodia's #1 trade partner, its #1 source of foreign investment, the #1 source of tourists. and an increasingly visible presence around the country. You know, the Chinese-made bridges were spanning the country's rivers. Chinese students and expatriates were coming and settling in larger numbers than ever before. And Chinese highways built under the aegis of the Belt and Road Initiative were opening up isolated parts of the country. And, you know, it made me very curious as to how, you know, this was playing out elsewhere in the region. And so as I was traveling around freelancing and you know, on all sorts of topics, I always kept one eye on sort of the China angle, what local people thought about China and what it was doing and the effects that Chinese investment projects were having on the ground.
And then, you know, eventually I think you began to travel around the region, I guess, more deeply and look at this. So, you know, getting started in Cambodia is interesting because China has a deep history in Cambodia that actually goes back thousands of years. In fact, the only written, from my understanding, and you write about it in your book, the only written record of early Khmer history comes from Chinese explorers and Chinese merchants that had visited the region. So getting into this historical observation, you know, I really started studying China and Southeast Asia at the end of the 90s, into the aughts, and paying close attention to what was happening from that point on. As a student of Southeast Asia and Asia, obviously you get into the colonial experience and the Cold War experience as well. But what I found really interesting about your book is its ability to cut through China's historical experience in these countries in the 70s and 80s, providing some levels of detail that you know, I had either missed in the past or just kind of glossed over. So the historical value of your writing, I think, is really significant. I'm wondering if there are any kind of turning points in China's experience in Southeast Asia that are noteworthy, and perhaps you could focus a little bit more on you know, the present or the last 20 years.
Right. Well, I think, I mean, the obvious sort of turning point was the 1970s. You know, Nixon's visit to China realigned or reset the strategic fault lines of East Asia and the wider Cold War, and, you know, paved the way for, you know, an opening of relations between anti-communist nations in Southeast Asia and the People's Republic of China. Obviously, then, you know, subsequently, the opening of China's economy at the end of the 1970s and through the 1980s was absolutely crucial. You know, it meant that China was trading more with these countries, relations warmed across the region. As a byproduct of that, restrictions, you know, a lot of prejudicial legislation and restrictions that had been placed on ethnic Chinese living in Southeast Asia were gradually removed. And during this period, as well as China's economy grew, it became, Southeast Asia assumed a new importance, where previously it had been sort of an arena for revolutionary activities and a way of sort of finding sort of revolutionary allies for Mao's China. It now became important, you know, in a new way in terms of China's growing economy. So, you know, in the maritime parts of Southeast Asia, the sea lanes upon which China's exports were now reaching the global markets became an increasingly important concern of Chinese strategists. At the same time, on the mainland of Southeast Asia, you know, there was a perception that this could be, you know, China could access the ocean from the west down directly to the Indian Ocean through Myanmar and to a certain extent Thailand, as well as building, you know, good trade relationships and investment relationships with these nations. And so, you know, Southeast Asia, you know, through the 1980s, that was really the pivot decade where, you know, it began to assume a new importance. And we see the sort of seeds of the present planted, you know, China's present strategic assertiveness in the South China Sea, and its, you know, its moves in mainland Southeast Asia are still motivated by these two basic concerns, to sort of establish control over the waters that lie close to China and through which billions of dollars of exports and imported crude oil pass, and also to you know, to gain access, direct access to the Indian Ocean through the mainland of Southeast Asia, to give China the Western Ocean, or proxy Western Ocean, you know, that for the ocean that it lacks.
thinking about more recent years, particularly with the rise, if you will, of the Xi Jinping administration or regime in Beijing, comes the Belt and Road Initiative. And, the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, gets a lot of coverage in the press. It's Xi Jinping's signature foreign policy project, and gets a lot of attention here in Washington as well. Many here in Washington look at it for its geopolitical implications and also often call out a number of so-called white elephant projects. These are infrastructure projects, high-speed rail, ports, dams, et cetera. How do you cover the Belt and Road in the book, and what do locals in Southeast Asia think of it?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that a lot of the projects that are now grouped under the Belt and Road were either pre-existing projects or they fulfill strategic and economic interests that predate the Belt and Road. So I think one overall sort of conclusion that I've drawn from researching this book is that it's a mistake to ascribe too much coherence and order to the Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, it really is a hugely complex and chaotic enterprise. And I think if you take, the headline pronouncements of the Chinese government at face value, it seems like this grand unified scheme. But when you get down to the ground, you realize that often it is projects are initiated at the whim of local elites in recipient countries. A lot of the Chinese firms that are involved in these projects have their own sort of motivations for undertaking them. And there's a lot of sort of private actors that are loosely associated with the Chinese state that also are involved and claim the Belt and Road and ape the Belt and Road rhetoric, whose interests often run counter to the Belt and Road and actually undermine core strategic aims of the Chinese government. In general, one of the problems with the Belt and Road and Chinese investment in general is that it's, under Chinese law, it's bound to respect local laws. But in a lot of the countries that I looked at in Southeast Asia, as you would know, I mean, these are countries that have very weak systems of governance in which laws are, either non-existent or poorly enforced. And so the result has been, in many cases, environmental degradation, dislocation of communities to build large-scale infrastructure projects, and sort of very little consultation with people that are on the ground. And so, there has been, an element of concern about the Belt and Road in just about every country.
Could you zoom in a bit and highlight a few of the Belt and Road projects that you cover in the book?
Well, one example is that we could look at the East Coast Rail Link in Malaysia. I mean, this was a project that was not initiated by the Chinese government. It was the Malaysian government under Najib Razak, who I think Malaysia had plans to build this railway for many years, and he finally pushed it forward. Of course, he had ulterior motives too, given the problems he was facing with the mega corruption scandal related to the Sovereign Wealth Fund 1MDB, which he was implicated in and which threatened to bring down his administration. And so he quite opportunistically, used, as his relations with the West soured, he got involved. He approached the Chinese about this project. They pledged a huge amount of money, and as it turns out, a certain proportion of that money was designed to sort of cover 1MDB debts, to put things simply. At least that's the very strong indication. And the Chinese also saw an opportunity to advance their interests, given that the rail link would have provided a land bridge over the Malayan Peninsula, and given China sort of an alternative, another sort of way of getting around the Malacca Strait and reducing its over-reliance on that maritime choke point. But this project was also, accompanied by massive concerns about debt. I mean, it was a $10 billion project, or 13 billion, I think. I'm getting my currency conversion mixed up. But it was hugely overpriced. And when I went to Malaysia in 2017, there were a lot of people I spoke to were deeply concerned about the long-term fiscal and impacts of this project.
I'm glad you mentioned debt. Often we hear with China's overseas expansion the term debt trap diplomacy, and at the same time, China talks about its projects and foreign assistance and loans as those which come with no strings attached. But many are quick to point at China's willingness to lend to high risk and low income developing countries, those countries where other less risk averse investors are not investing. And those countries often don't have the capability to service loans in the medium or long term, or at least that's the perception. And a lot of people call this a form of debt trap diplomacy. And did you find instances of this in Southeast Asia?
Well, I think the debt trap diplomacy thesis, argues essentially that China is using debt purposefully. It's actually intended to trap small countries in schemes of debt which they can't escape, and therefore to advance Chinese strategic interests accordingly.
So is that a myth, or is there something really?
Well, I think there's definitely concerns about debt. When you're dealing with a small country like Laos, which is the recipient of a $6 billion railway through the northern part of the country. Now, Laos isn't paying for that entire $6 billion itself. I think the total liability was 400 and something million.
Right, 450 million or something like
that. Yeah. But this is this is a lot of money for a small country like Laos.
Sure.
And
with a annual GDP of $7 billion.
Right. And the whole project is virtually the whole country's GDP. And so I think there's a lot of worry about debt, and given that China has strategic interests in all of these regions, that naturally connects to the sort of sense that China, if you were indebted to China, you might be forced to give up something really important and strategic, and that could create further problems for your nation as well. But I don't see much evidence that the Chinese government is purposefully seeking to entrap nations. I mean, it's I think that a lot of the nations that China deals with aren't, have been not particularly good at negotiating the terms. China's terms, if in certain cases, they've offered terms that haven't been that competitive compared to what the Japanese or some of the international financial institutions have offered. But, in some cases, that's what they've been, the recipient nations have agreed to it. So there's really, I think it's important to see that there's really two sides to often to how these deals shake out. At least in Southeast Asia, a lot of nations have demonstrated a certain amount of agency in, sort of deciding what they want and what they don't. And as I said before, a lot of these projects have actually been initiated by recipient countries. They haven't sort of been planned centrally by the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs or Chinese state-owned firms. They do align to some extent, in some cases, with local development needs or the preferences of local elites.
I need to correct myself. In thinking, I realized that Laos annual GDP is somewhere around $10 billion, not $7 billion. So I don't want to be off of that. We have a few more minutes in our interview, and then we're going to move into our discussion section with our panelists. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about ethnic Chinese people in the region. And China's ethnic population has been part of the region for millennia and have played a critically important role of the region's historical development, both economically, politically, through and through. China has always been there. And China will always be active in the region, ethnic Chinese and Chinese migrants. I've noted in my own research and observations that when China's reputation is rosy in the region, citing like roughly 2002 to 2010, ethnic Chinese are really happy to show off their Chinese identity. But then when China's reputation is on the wane, they tend to wear the cloaks, if you will. There's flexible identity in some of these countries of the nations in which they live. So how does your book assess the current state of the Chinese diaspora in the region? And are there differences, maybe, lumping, say, ethnic Chinese together in the mainland diaspora versus the maritime diaspora, or maybe they can't be lumped together?
Well, I think in retrospect, the period lasting from sort of the 1980s through to sort of the end of the 2010s will probably be looked at in retrospect as sort of a golden era for ethnic Chinese populations of Southeast Asia. Before that, during the Cold War, as I hinted at earlier, in a lot of countries, ethnic Chinese were subject to all manner of, prejudicial legislation and restrictions,
Right.
and informal discrimination. They were very frequently seen as a fifth column for Chinese communism. And it was when relations with China improved with a lot of countries in the 1980s, including some nations that up until the 1970s had no formal diplomatic relationship with the People's Republic of China at all. It suddenly became, these restrictions were gradually removed, and it became safe to proclaim one's and take pride in one's ethnic Chinese heritage. Then the economy began to grow. The Chinese economy opened up, and business relationships began to move backwards and forwards. And ethnic Chinese, a lot of ethnic Chinese conglomerates in Southeast Asia sunk a lot of money into the mainland and profited accordingly. And on the Chinese side too, the Chinese government made a very clear distinction in that he passed a nationality law in 1980 that drew a very firm distinction between Chinese cultural affiliations and loyalty to the Chinese state. So that all of these things helped sort of relax the situation. The danger we're seeing now is that under Xi Jinping, the Chinese government is deepening its outreach to the ethnic Chinese populations of Southeast Asia through any number of mechanisms. It's beginning to describe them as part of a greater Chinese family, and urging them to inviting them to come help build the Belt and Road Initiative and fulfill the China Dream, and all of these sorts of CCP slogans. And it's, what it's doing is sort of smudging the distinction that has pertained up over the last few decades between being, ethnic Chinese and Chinese culturally, and being, loyal to the Chinese state. And it's starting to blur those boundaries. Mm-hmm. The acceptance of ethnic Chinese in a lot of Southeast Asian countries has been premised on on this distinction being upheld. And I think it's quite dangerous. Not only does it run the risk of Beijing complicating its relationships with a lot of Southeast Asian nations, and hamstring its interests, it also runs the risk of backfiring on these ethnic Chinese communities themselves. And they frequently, through history, especially in certain countries, been subject to discrimination and violence, even. And so this is I think a subject of concern throughout the region. I think that in certain places now, you're right. As China's reputation becomes, China begins to elicit more fear and suspicion from the region, especially as regards its relationship with these diasporas. People are becoming a little bit more wary about how and when they express their Chineseness and in what forms.
Interesting, and this is something certainly to watch into the future as more nationalist movements emerge, climate change impacts groups, and political, again, nationalism begins to point the finger at certain groups, and at the same time the region seems to be moving away from a lot of the former enthusiasm for democratization and deepening democracy. There was a lot of hope, I think, in the 90s and the early aughts that some of these countries would more deeply democratize, and it seems like that's the opposite trend is happening. Just very quickly before we move to our panelist discussion, your book, you haven't written a book about U.S. Engagement in Southeast Asia. That's not the purpose of your book, but at times you're critical of the United States and the U.S. being far and away from Southeast Asia. It's an important zone of commerce, I think, as well as there's treaty allies, Thailand and Philippines in Southeast Asia. But we're kind of seen as an offshore balancer, and in that context, we are either the U.S. is either seen as somebody that will be viewed with suspicion, a country that's viewed with suspicion if it's engaging deeply in Southeast Asia, or one that might easily pull out. What are your recommendations for, or a few of your recommendations for U.S. engagement in the region that you make in the book?
Well, I think you're very right about being an offshore balancer. It's you're either too closely involved or not involved enough. And it's very hard to get that balance just right for all 10 nations of ASEAN. So there's always going to be that. I think there's some concerns about the current administration's approach. I think that there's a sense that you know, a lot of its engagement with Southeast Asia is framed basically in the context of its rivalry with China, which, as we all know, is been accelerating and intensifying over the past 3 years. And there's, you know, and there's a sort of sense that the US is looking through Southeast Asia to its rival in East Asia, and the region is sort of lies in the middle, but it's a lot of the sort of views of Southeast Asian nations and their concerns are being overlooked. I think that, you know, it's important for American policymakers to realize that Southeast Asian nations have concerns about China, really well-founded fears and suspicions of Chinese intentions, but those differ in significant ways from the fears and concerns that the United States have. I mean, for one example, I think, is that Southeast Asian nations in general don't see ideology as quite as important as the current administration claims to. We hear, you know, some Secretary of State Pompeo speaking in sort of this like starkly ideological language about the coming showdown between freedom and authoritarianism. And I don't think most of the nations in Southeast Asia, at least the leaders of the nations, tend to view things that way. They tend to see that actually they have some, you know, certain shared interests with China in addition to the economic interactions that bind the two regions. So I would also advise that the US sort of play down the ideological rhetoric and recognize that Southeast Asian nations see it basically as a question of power, not as a question specifically of principles, and that they want a balance of power that you know, enables them a certain room for maneuver, but they don't want an escalating tensions that threaten to break out into conflict, a conflict which could very well involve Southeast Asian nations.
Right, there's always that danger of forcing countries to choose, and we've seen how that has played out in the past, unfortunately. So I think as we move through our event today, since we are mostly drawing in a Washington-based crowd or a US-based crowd, not necessarily, we probably have participants in this webinar that are calling in from all over the world. I would anticipate there'll be more questions about US engagement in Southeast Asia. Let's move into our panelist portion of the book launch. And this is an opportunity for our panelists to provide some reactions to your book, as well as some discussion points. And I hope that after my colleague Yun Sun and Jane Perlez provide their comments, that the three of you, or the four of us, can have a brief discussion about what is raised during this discussion session. So I'll move to Stimson's China Program Director, Yun Sun, first, to provide some brief commentary on her read of the book and some questions for you.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Sebastian. Kudos to a really fantastic publication on China-Southeast Asia relations. We know that recently, for the second half of this year, there are a couple of books about this topic, but what I really appreciate from your publication, from your book, is not only a dissect or an analysis of what is currently happening, but also what is a historical background that have paved the ground for China's approach to Southeast Asia today. So I have primarily three comments and correspondingly three comments about three questions. And I would love to get a sense from you as to how you evaluate some of the key questions between China and Southeast Asia. The first one that is one of the points that you made in your book, which is focused on Southeast Asia's central status to China's ambition. So not only regional ambition, but also global ambition. So I think that raises a very interesting point because it tries to compare Southeast Asia with other regions, for example, on China's periphery, and how do we rank the prioritization of these different subregions in China's foreign policy hierarchy, if there is such a hierarchy. And I wonder how you would rank it, because if we look at China's national security, Northeast Asia is usually where China perceives most stringent national security threat, such as on Korean Peninsula, war on Taiwan. And if we look at the Belt and Road, the general direction is for China to go west, go in the west, the direction of the west. So there's a polar Silk Road through the Arctic, and the belt of the Belt and Road actually goes through South Asia and Central Asia through the land bridge to Europe. So in comparison, what made the judgment that Southeast Asia is central to China's ambition? And where would you put Southeast Asia in China's regional hierarchy? Secondly, since your description of the BRI initiative in Southeast Asia is particularly illuminating, because like you just pointed out, the BRI initiative, other than the fact that we are seeing a lot of white elephant projects like Brian mentioned, it's actually quite chaotic and less systematic or well organized than many of the foreign observers would like to believe. And what you pointed out about the intentionality or the lack of intentionality or the purposefulness of China's debt trap diplomacy, I think is particularly important angle to understand the effectiveness or the lack of effectiveness in China's BRI diplomacy. So I guess related to that, especially for Southeast Asia, now we know that COVID-19 has further slowed down China's economy. And China is being required or being asked by the developing world to participate in initiatives such as SSDI, to provide debt forgiveness or debt suspension to the most affected, heavily indebted countries. So what that means is that the financial resources that Beijing has available at its disposal to spend along the BRI is going to become much tighter compared to before. And I think this happened even before COVID-19. If you look at the second BRI summit in Beijing last year, the summit basically redefined the priority of BRI to quality projects instead of focusing on the quantity. So I think that also illustrates the Chinese desire to avoid this mounting debts that the BRI countries owe to China. As debt trap diplomacy or the debt equity swap is not always an ideal way to go, because look at the Sri Lanka's Hambantota port example, it only casts more doubt and suspicion about China's intention by lending this much money to BRI countries. So looking forward, how would you assess that the BRI's continuation in Southeast Asia, or are we going to see some level of moderation or even some level of reduction in the region? And this last comment and question is, Brian actually covered it very well. So if we look at the regional power dynamic and look at the US-China interaction in Southeast Asia, we hear every Southeast Asian country saying to both great powers, don't force us to choose. We don't want to choose. We don't want to be made to choose. And you said it very well that Southeast Asia would like to keep this balance of power between US and China. They don't want to side with one over the other. But you also provided some recommendations that US needs to heed this intention or this desire to play bloc diplomacy to force Southeast Asia into this impossible and difficult position. But I wonder, what would a desirable US policy look like then? So if it's not bloc diplomacy, which is very much a zero-sum calculation and looking at Southeast Asia through the lens of China, what is the alternative to that? I can think of two. One is a rules-based inclusivity. So for US to be in charge or to lead the regional norms and the rules and try to immerse China through these, or control China's behavior through these international norms. And another possibility is what ASEAN probably would like to see, which is ASEAN centrality. Empower ASEAN to lead. So ASEAN will be the central voice in this power dynamic and making the rules and dictate what US and China would individually be allowed to do. And of course, the challenge to that is ASEAN really capable of playing that role, and whether that should be a position that US should support. So I would love to get your thoughts on these three questions. Again, a great publication, a great book. I think all students of China, Southeast Asia, or even China BRI should read your book. Thank you, Sebastian.
Thank you,
Brian.
Thanks,
should we go?
I've been taking notes and dropping Yun's questions into our chat, into our panelist chat line. So let's move to Jane's commentary, and then we can get back to the questions collectively after Jane's commentary.
Sounds good.
Hi, everyone. Greetings from Manhattan. I just want to commend Sebastian for a book on perhaps my favorite region of the world. It's not easy to write about nearly a dozen countries and make a cohesive whole, though when you have a challenge like China bearing down on the whole enterprise and focusing on the region like a laser beam, that makes a pretty excellent narrative right there. And I have to say, all of those who are listening in, Sebastian really makes it happen. So I really recommend the book. And if you don't mind, because I'm a journalist, I'm going to follow, and not a sort of academic theoretician, I'm going to just follow some threads that Sebastian has dealt with and that I actually covered when I was posted in Jakarta 2002 to 2006 or 7, and then when I was recently posted in Beijing. But first, just a small bit of personal history. When I was in Jakarta, I watched the seeds of what you could call the China onslaught in Southeast Asia. It seems so quaint now, but in 2004, I wrote 3 articles about China's growing influence in Southeast Asia. The New York Times called them China's Reach, a kind of mini series, but they were among the first to deal with the subject in the American media. So even before I wrote those pieces, Wen Jiabao turned up at the ASEAN summit in Bali in 2003. He was the first Chinese premier to show up in ASEAN summit. And the lead of my story was something about China's leader getting together with his colleagues. It was all very polite and very benign, and ASEAN countries were hungry for Chinese investment. And American businessmen were conspicuously absent. That was really the most interesting thing, even as early as that. Then just a few years later, Yang Jiechi was staring at George Yeo, then a Singapore minister at the time, saying at a summit in Hanoi, hey, China's a big country and all the rest of you are very small. So that gave us a taste of what was about to come, I think. Then just a few years later after that, Xi was the first foreign leader to address the Indonesian parliament, talking about how China and Indonesia must stick together through thick and thin. So it's been a pretty steady trajectory, which Sebastian really follows. And so let's take Indonesia, where I think Sebastian's very skilled at pointing out Indonesia's problems with China based on its past history and on its increasingly conservative Muslim population. And I think Sebastian is right to emphasize how Indonesia stood up to China and is likely to remain resistant to China, particularly over naval issues. There was a tiny piece of the Indonesia puzzle that I would have liked to have seen more of in the narrative. And that's how China's web companies, Alibaba in particular, are investing billions in Indonesian digital firms and are positioning themselves on advisory boards and places close to the government so they can influence important things that are coming down the pike on how the internet develops and how everything develops digitally in Indonesia. So moving from the most populous country in the region to one of the smallest, I like the way Sebastian told the story of the railway and the politics of the financing of the railway in Laos. And I love the way he wrapped up that chapter with his conversation with one of the former royals. So he sits down with one of the princes, I think it's in Luang Prabang or somewhere up there in northern Laos. And the prince says, well, we've weathered everything, the French, the Americans in Vietnam, the Vietnamese themselves, the Thais, and we'll weather China too, he says. Adaptation is our politics. And I have a feeling that Laos is not the only place where that is true, actually. The heavy hand of China was so clear in the extraterritorial arrest of the drug kingpin in the Golden Triangle, Noor Kham, who had killed 13 Chinese seamen on the Mekong River. I actually interviewed the head of the Narcotics Control Bureau in Beijing, Liu Weijin, who Sebastian really describes very pointedly as hard-bitten and an anti-drug veteran. And he was just like that when I interviewed him in the public security ministry in Beijing, a hard to penetrate fortress, by the way. His chapter on Vietnam called Different Shades of Red is really, I think, a standout. Very smart, Sebastian, to open with Lang Son, I should say, the border town where the Chinese troops invaded their neighbor in 1979. I went there too, and the feelings are still so raw, and I think they well up and show very clearly feelings throughout Vietnam towards China. Overall, I totally agree with Sebastian when he says the region is too economically intertwined with China to enlist in a US-led coalition. But actually the point is, as we all know, is there is no US-led coalition. There is no US leadership. And anyway, even if there was a scintilla of American leadership, there is no way, as Sebastian says, that countries of Southeast Asia are going to comply with one of Washington's premier demands. Stop Huawei from joining your 5G internet. I mean, the countries are just not going to do that in Southeast Asia. And I like the way at the end of the book, Sebastian, you quote the great Bilahari Kautokan, the former Foreign Secretary of Singapore, saying Southeast Asia is too diverse to fall under the spell of one superpower. I know this is a favorite tune of Bilahari's, and I'm loath to disagree with him. But I think given the proximity, self-interest, financial wherewithal, and the total absence of the United States, no matter who wins in November, it looks like China can only increase its power in the region and indeed place the region under its spell. So those are my sort of comments on the book, which I recommend for everybody to read. And I just have a couple of brief questions, really. Is it all over in the South China Sea, Sebastian? Does China effectively own it? Does the United States care that much? What could the United States do if it had the will, if it really had the will? What could it do to make a more even contest with China in the ASEAN countries? And what's going to, given the situation now that we're in the COVID era, and hopefully we get to a post-COVID era, what do you reckon is the future of the Laos Railroad? That's it for me.
Okay.
Great book.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate it. So,
Those are
Brian,
a
do you
lot
want
of
me to
questions,
answer any of these,
Sebastian,
or
and
go through them together one by one?
I'm not sure if we'll have time to get through all of them, but we definitely have 10 minutes to discuss this.
Okay. Great, great. Well, I'd quite like Yun's question about the ranking of Southeast Asia in Chinese foreign policy priority. I think that's, I mean, I'm not a China specialist, so, you know, it's maybe not something that I can offer a definitive answer to, but I think one of the things I argue in the book is not so much that Southeast Asia is the most important region for China, but it occupies a unique position for China in that, you know, it's the one area around China's periphery where there really isn't an entrenched great power kind of constraining the expansion of Chinese influence. So, you know, this perception in Beijing that the country's been encircled by, you know, either nuclear armed rivals like Russia and India, or US treaty allies like South Korea, Japan, and the Philippines, and that they're sort of trying to hold China in. Southeast Asia is one place where there is a bit of egress for Chinese influence, that they're relatively small countries. It's a fairly fragmented region geographically. And so this is sort of establishing sort of a sphere of influence or an effective control over this region or influence over this region is you know, important in sort of, you know, it may not be the #1 priority that China has, but it certainly helps enable, it's an important enabling region in terms of securing China's, the security of the Chinese economy, and you know, and gaining access to the maritime, the oceanic thoroughfare, because of course South China Sea, you know, to the east of that is, you know, the Pacific Ocean. And so if China can establish its control within the first island chain, then, you know, then it can project its power, you know, further afield. And of course, you know, the belt, I get confused, belt and road. The road is the maritime part. It's very confusing. But the roads, they all, you know, to go from China west, they all have to go through Southeast Asia, as all of China's, you know, a lot of China's global exports do, and as its imports from Middle Eastern crude oil do as well. So it's an important first stop on the road in that respect. So Jane asked, is it all over in the South China Sea? I would, it's a very difficult situation because China is basically on its home turf in this, in terms of the dispute between the United States and China and how they both see it. And, it has, an asymmetrical advantage. The US has much more powerful military deployed globally, or able to be deployed globally, but China has the advantage of proximity, and it would be, if there was to be a conflict, it would be fighting in its backyard, and I think that it means a lot more for China than it does for the United States, at least at the moment. And so, what is the US willing to risk? Like, how many aircraft carriers is it willing to lose in order to make a point about? And I guess that's sort of the danger of this, is that the only way that China can make escalatory moves in the South China Sea, and then call the United States bluff, and it's ultimately, how big a price is the US willing to pay to maintain hegemony in that region? And it's very difficult, because it's, thousands of pages have been written about what happens when there is an incumbent power and a rising power, and how they interact, and there's a certain logic to the escalating competition between the two powers. But unfortunately, the trend lines are all moving in a pretty worrying direction in terms of the likelihood of some kind of conflict. So yeah, I mean, in terms of what should the US do in the region? I mean, it's a very difficult question. In some ways, the US is being forced to come to terms with a world in which it is no longer the only significant power. There is inevitable, even if China was not engaging in the sort of assertive behavior that it has been over the past decade, there has been a massive shift of wealth from west to east. It's not just China; it's India. It's a lot of other formerly developing nations in Southeast Asia and Southeast Asia and other parts of the world as well. And I think that inevitably is going to involve a relative decline. And what the United States does in Southeast Asia is a subset of the broader question of how it handles the transition from sort of being the only significant superpower to being, one perhaps still the most powerful in itself, but relatively less powerful compared to others. And there's no real easy answer to that, I don't think. I mean, again, people are arguing about this, people who are much more qualified than I am about some of the sort of military type, questions to do with this. I think that if the US wants to expand its influence in Southeast Asia, I think it needs to meet China's challenge on the grounds that it's most significant, which is economics. It needs to do more to sort of support the region's development challenges and development needs, and build. I think it should be more pragmatic too. I think that's another thing. I think that values are a very important part of foreign policy. There's certainly a place for them, but I think there's a sort of sense in which we should pick our battles a bit about this. I think that there are some sorts of human rights abuses that have to be called out by nations that claim to believe in these principles. But it's also the case that for relatively minor, it's sometimes putting pressure on governments in the region. It activates an anti-colonial reflex, which over the last couple of decades has tended to push these countries towards China, which I argue in the book that one of China's most in-demand exports is protection from Western pressure, or a shield from Western diplomatic and economic pressure, mostly to do with human rights issues. And so I think that there's a need to be a lot more hard-headed about these sorts of things, and to downplay the ideological rhetoric, and to I think the Trans-Pacific Partnership was a massive missed opportunity. And Yoon talked about sort of setting the norms for the region. I mean, this is one potential way that a hegemonic power can prepare for its own relative decline, which is to set all of the norms, and then hopefully those norms will at least partially constrain the rising power. Whether it can do so in any sort of lasting and significant way is another question.
Thanks, Sebastian. I'd love to have Yoon and Jane provide you with some responses to your answers. And perhaps we can get to that in this next section, the final Q&A session. We're going to turn this over now to my colleague, Courtney Weatherby, who's been watching the Q&A queue fill in. We've got 19 questions in here already. There's no way we can get over them in just about 10 minutes. But these questions should be most squarely asked to Sebastian. Yoon, Jane, feel free to jump in with responses as well if you are so moved.
Great. So in the interest of time, I'm going to end up combining a few of the different questions that were asked in the audience, although we will share the full transcript with Sebastian and others after the call. So the first question is in regards to Chinese investments in Southeast Asia. Have there been significant negative impacts on the environment, on food security, on fisheries or other natural resources? And in cases where there have been impacts from major projects, what are the options that countries in the region have to respond to China, and how does that differ, or is it similar to the options that they have in engaging with other countries who are active in the region?
Well, yeah, there's certainly been negative effects of all manner of negative externalities associated with Chinese investments. As I mentioned at the beginning, that China is often operating in environments with very weak governance structures, and where international financial institutions and other Western investors, often have a lot of difficulty operating given the prevalence of corruption and poor legal frameworks and et cetera. One problem in Southeast Asia is that there's not that many, truly democratic governments. And so you have situations where those governments are also involved in pushing these projects, and they're not necessarily on the lookout for, the needs of individual people that are displaced by a project or otherwise harmed by it. We saw this in the case of Myanmar, in the Myitsone Dam project in the north of Myanmar, which was agreed with a Chinese company in 2006. The military government, as it then was of Myanmar, didn't really take into consideration the views of local people at all. I mean, it had its own reasons for pushing this project, obviously wanting as a source of power and ability to export power to China and to earn income. And its view was that this needed to happen, and that the concerns of local people were not relevant to the question. They were all relegated. Then the dam was suspended in 2011 when the country opened, reformed and opened to the West. It's still in a state of suspended animation. But that's, one example. In a lot of places, it's not just the Chinese who are coming in and doing this. They're also, local governments are also involved in greenlighting these projects, and they often do not take into consideration the needs of their own people. Or they have their eyes fixed on a longer term vision for their country's development, which can justify these people's sacrifice. If anyone else wants to jump in, feel free, of course.
Sebastian, I just wanted to ask one thing. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
What do you think is what's the post-COVID economic picture going to look at, generally speaking, in Southeast Asia?
Well, I mean, there's so much water still to go under the bridge. I think we're just seeing now the beginnings of the economic downturn, which is likely probably to last for a very long time. And exactly how far it goes and to what extent it dominoes over into political crises, we may be seeing the first of those in Thailand right now, really remains to be seen. I think in terms of China's influence in the region, I think, the Chinese probably, I think certainly lost, the Chinese image was dulled by its own handling of COVID-19 when it first broke out in central China. I think that there's, that certainly hasn't endeared the region to Beijing. I think also the fact that it took the opportunity to push maritime claims while other nations were dealing with their first outbreaks of COVID, is also something that's a concern in the region. And, but the American response also hasn't been very good. It's the lack of leadership in being able to contain the crisis within the United States, I think is, it's punctured the impression of American competence in a really damaging way. And so in relative terms, China and the United States probably are in a pretty similar position in terms of the views of Southeast Asians as they were before pandemic. I think that the longer term, I think one of the, China's relationship with Southeast Asia there's in many ways a structural sort of component to it, which is the geographic proximity of the two regions. And that proximity isn't going away. And in fact, COVID could even, accentuate the importance of that proximity. So as Southeast Asian nations look to rebuild their economies and get their people back to work, China, which is on the road to recovery from COVID, at least at the moment, looms as an important partner. In Thailand, you often hear people complain about Chinese tourists. They're rude, they're uncouth, they have no manners, and all this sort of thing. But I think that they will be welcomed back with open arms, given the state of the Thai tourist industry at the moment. So I think that China will. I think this, there's a lot of unknowns, but I think that China's still going to be there at the end of the pandemic.
I think it's going to give them a big opportunity, actually.
You could be right.
Well, just sort of picking up on that and speaking of opportunities and partnerships, we had a few questions about the role of other countries in the region. As you started discussing that it's not just US and China, we had a question specifically about how Japan has been involved, because the extent of Japanese investment and development assistance is quite significant. How effective has Japan been at using that engagement to generate influence? And is there sort of a balancing act that they can play? We had another question about the role of India. India gets a lot of attention as a potential partner for the region. Can you talk about sort of how you view those or other partners outside of the US-China dynamic?
And
Sure.
just jumping in there, I think Courtney identified book 2 and book 3, the follow-on books. Sebastian direct.
Oh, God help me. So I'll start with India, because that's, I think, a little bit easier to dispatch. I think, India really still punches under its weight in Southeast Asia. I think that India's strategic focus, this may be beginning to change, but is generally being towards the West, towards its tense rivalry with Pakistan, and increasingly towards the North, to China itself. And while Modi's government has sort of pledged to expand relationships with the ASEAN nations, India's investment presence in Southeast Asia remains fairly scant. Its trade with the region is fairly small. I think that there's a lot of opportunity there, but at the moment, I think it's something that could become an important factor in the future, but right now still sort of remains slightly peripheral. Now, Japan is a very important piece of this puzzle. I mean, we forget sometimes that Japan is the third largest economy in the world, a leader in world-class manufacturers and precision technologies of various kinds, a technological leader. I think Japan meets China's challenge on its own terms. Japan is engaged in building huge amounts of infrastructure across Southeast Asia. It really offers an alternative to the Belt and Road. The Belt and Road is kind of the cheap, and quick way of getting things done, which has a certain amount of appeal in the region. But Japanese projects tend to be built to, higher, more consistent specifications. The quality of Chinese projects varies a lot from country to country, and depending on what the local conditions are. And I think there's a large appetite for engagement with Japan. Opinion surveys done by the SES Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore late last year showed that, declining trust in China and the United States, but increasing trust in Japan. And I think that, it has a very important role to play. Now that Abe stepped down, we don't really know how. I think his leadership over the past decade has been very important for kind of putting Japan on the map in Southeast Asia, and further afield as well. And it remains to be seen, if Japan returns to the revolving door governments of the previous period, that could have a negative impact on its foreign policy as well. But we'll have to wait and see.
Sebastian, I'm glad that you landed on that point of how will Prime Minister Suga, treat engagement with Southeast Asia. Yoon has a quick follow-up to this.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. Thank you, Sebastian. So I really appreciate your focus on Japan, because Japan has been regarded as this quality alternative to what China has to offer, not only in Southeast Asia, we also see that for example, in Africa. But then I think in the audience, there's also a similar question. So what explains the fact that Southeast Asian countries do choose Chinese financing? Is it a quantity problem that Japan is not offering as much? Or is a geopolitical or geographical proximity problem that China is just so close? Or there's something qualitatively different here, which has promoted the Southeast Asian countries to go the Chinese way?
I think that it is, a lot of it's to do with speed and lack of sort of, like the Japanese have standards, and they're very, the Japanese, I think they're very pragmatic, so they're willing to deal with corrupt governments or governments that have a reputation for for corruption. They don't have so much of an issue with engaging on that level, but they do want projects to be properly vetted, and for there to be, they have a process, and that process takes a long time. And I think that there is the Chinese are almost eager to get things going quickly often, and so there's I think that it's it's often just a lot simpler. And I'm not an expert on exactly what conditionalities attached to Japanese loans. I mean, there may be good governance requirements that for certain countries in the region, like Cambodia or Laos, are a little bit onerous, and they find it easier just to take the no conditions Chinese alternative. But I think it's a lot of that. It's also the fact that if your country has a good relationship with China, like the Cambodian government does, it's almost sort of I think there's a certain expectation that they'll employ Chinese state companies to build things. But by the same token, Japan is building a lot in Cambodia too, in terms of bridges and highways, as is the Asian Development Bank, which obviously Japan has a great deal of control over. So yeah, that's basically my answer. That would be my rough guess.
Thank you.
Well, Sebastian, we've come to the end of our hour. I do want to give you a chance to provide some final words and perhaps some words of inspiration to those who want to continue writing on Southeast Asia, on China and Southeast Asia. Could you leave our audience with some advice on writing on Southeast Asia and some best practices?
Oh, it's an interesting question. I think in broad terms, if I was speaking to aspiring journalists, I think you've got to take history really seriously. You see, one of the things that I learned researching this book is that Southeast Asian views of China have been shaped in very complex ways by centuries of interactions with China's people and its various governments. And that all of these things have left residues that are part of the mix today when we talk about China's influence in the region. The history of Western imperialism has always also left an incredibly profound mark on Southeast Asia. I think that the legacies of imperialism are still being worked through today. We see that in the challenges that Myanmar has in forging a cohesive, inclusive nation from an incredible ethnic diversity. We see it in the demographic transformations wrought by British imperialism in Malaysia, and the way that the relationship between ethnic Chinese and ethnic Indians whose ancestors were imported into the colony to work on rubber plantations and in tin mines, still elicit great deals of concerns from ethnic Malay majority of the country. And so I think all of these things are part of the mix, and all of them impact developments in these countries, and also impact their relations with powers, not just China, but also the United States. And I think I would probably, one final thing is to also be aware, if you're American, of the way that American perceptions of China have been shaped by history. and by culture. I think that's an important part of the mix too. The U.S. has had a very distinct way of looking at China as sort of this subject to be converted. You know, the missionaries had that view of China, and there's this sort of constant, you know, sort of attraction, love and hate sort of relationship that that has existed between the two countries for a very, very long time. And I think we're seeing in the latest superpower rivalry is sort of one more iteration of that sort of pattern. And I'd advise you to bear all of that in mind.
Sebastian, thank you so much. And my advice to everyone that's calling in is to find a copy of this book. It's available for sale now on hardcover as well as digital version. It's a great read, very nuanced. It gets into all the complexities that should be examined for China's historical and economic and political relationship with Southeast Asia. I want to extend a big thank you to Sebastian Strangio for calling in from Australia tonight to lead us through his book. Also to my colleague Yun Sun and Jane Perlez. Jane's calling in from New York. This has been a really enlightening launch of your book, Sebastian. I know you're doing many of these launches, and I hope that ours provided kind of a particular focus on that would appeal to, say, a US-based audience. What's next for us is we're going to have an event at the end of October, another book launch. This is a book that was released last year, The United States, Southeast Asia, and Historical Memory. And one of the authors, Noam Chomsky, has kindly agreed to give a keynote address as we talk about the contents of this very interesting edited volume. So that's next from us, from the Stimson Southeast Asia program. Again, big thank you to Yun, Jane, Sebastian, my Stimson colleagues for a very successful event. Sebastian, I wish you all the best with the future of this book and your continued writing on Southeast Asia and China and Southeast Asia.
Thanks a lot, Brian. It was a real privilege. And thank you to Jane and Yun as well for helping me launch the book. I really appreciate it.
Thank you all. We'll see you next time.